I can't use the word traditional to describe Anno. I can't even use the first word of its title because it shares it with another game series. Anno Mutationem is a Metroidvania disguising itself as an open world action game. It's also a bad anime in video game form. This game still gets a good amount of praise from me because I hope that future indie games look at the design of Anno and replicate it to greater effect. I say this in all honesty because this game is pretty lame, and you may not be able to tell that if you look up reviews for the game before playing. When I bought the game on PS4, the Steam reviews were mixed, and by the time I finished the game, it was mostly positive. By the time of me writing this, it has a 71 Metascore and a 7.8 user score. Reading some of the reviews actually showed me that the game is as mixed as it can be, because it's split between two crowds, the people who like the cyberpunk genre and indie games so much that they'll love anything that's pretty enough, and the other crowd who judge the game for all of its individual pieces together. I believe I'm in the latter group because the individual pieces of Anno are interesting, but they could really use some work. A lot of work. Putting them together really makes something that fails to be as engaging as it could be. There are so many parts of this game that feel dead, like they weren't given the life that they needed, and it shows in those individual pieces. And that's my spoiler-free review of the game. In the next session, I'm going to be going over the story, combat, and all those pieces in between. I may sound harsh in some places, but bear with me as I try to explain my points. Anno Mutationem starts off with a cutscene that's pretty hard to follow. This intro doesn't really give us any details in the story and instead just infers something I'm sure the game wants us to know about. We start out by watching this random spot in the world being bombed for some reason. Considering that this is a cyberpunk world, we could take this as some sort of strange anomaly on the planet, but they never explain that. Or better yet, nothing that we see happen in the story really reinforces what happens in the intro. Next, we see a man presenting some papers to a council of sorts. He gets rejected, gets angry, and then the scene automatically cuts to our main character having a dream of herself lost in some snowy wasteland. Then she wakes up and gets a package from her best friend. So our protagonist's name is Anne Flores. She's a gun for hire and works alongside her best friend Ayane Misuno, a brilliant hacker who is in love with Anne. Anno's story is what I would call unimpressive. There is so much in this game that is unexplored and left to just exist in the vacuum that is this game's boring world. A world that you are let loose in as soon as you start the game, so let's do that before we head back to the story. Anno's world is pretty beautiful to look at from both a distance and up close. Just staying within Anne's apartment, you'll see that the game has a mixture of 2D and 3D elements to build each environment. Sometimes the camera can be a bit too close to these 3D objects to make them look less than impressive, but it's fine because it's only 50% of the game. The other half is obviously 2D pixel art. That is impressive to me because it adds more to each level and scene that you're in. Most of the games have already perfected having objects and characters in the background of a map, but Anno goes a step further and has 3D spaces in which you can occupy that have things and people to interact with. When I walked out of Anne's apartment for the first time, I was floored. The building you walk out of immediately blends into the rest of the environment in a way that first seems unrealistic. Then I started to explore the rest of Scop City. This is where the game first starts and it actually has a lot to look into. Nearly every person has a conversation you can listen to. There are posters around the city that have information on them that add to the world building. The many shops are filled with items that you can read about, not to mention that anyone that isn't one of the many reused sprites are interesting characters in their own ways. One that you'll come across instantly will be a guy in a sewer and the girl selling frozen treats. These two are actually linked to one of the first side quests you can do in the game. Starting the game with all that information gave me a lot of hope going forward. See, this game very clearly wants to be a Metroidvania. The game will grant you upgrades to your basic moveset as you go through the story, including a wall climb and a double jump. But these are only for a handful of moments in the game, so selective that they are inconsequential to the entire experience. And this is before I get into the combat, which I can describe as boring as fuck. Those upgrades aren't the only way the game fails at being a Metroidvania. There are many separated zones in the game that you could easily call traditional levels in a Metroidvania, but there exist two major problems. The first is that these all share a similar visual theme of boring science fiction labs or a destroyed location that leads into a science fiction lab. The only place that is separated from this is the massive ship, but that area is so boring that I'm just going to count it with the rest. The second issue is that even if you remove the first problem here, these levels are boring. They don't have any cool level design or fun concepts that spread across the entire area. Not to mention that a majority of the levels are all smashed together into one long chain of zones at the end of the game. This would be fun because that's how Metroidvanias work, but there are 5 major locations in the game that you can visit, or 5 hub areas for lack of a better term. Margarita has no levels and exists just to show you where On grew up. Noctis is just Scop City but at night. The freeway does in fact have a zone, but it's the most inconsequential one, which is really sad considering that this is the place that actually covers some of the game's lore, which I'll be bringing up later. That leaves the harbor, which has that boat level, and Scop City, which has like 4 or 5 zones connected to each other all underneath the city that we brought up earlier. I really don't have much to say about any of these areas. You show up and do whatever the game tells you. In Scop City and Noctis, there's only a small amount of side quests, but that's it. The freeway has a totally different atmosphere than the other areas, but it's so small, and the harbor is just that, a harbor town. I'm not even sure if there was a side quest here, that's how forgettable it was. Looking at the maps for each of these zones show a complete misuse of the area. I'm guessing that the thick orange lines are supposed to be the walkable zones, and everything else isn't. The way this is set up, it really painted a picture in my mind that I was going to get more content, but no, this is all that I got. And once again, 2 out of these 5 zones have side quests in them. If every major city in the game had its own set of levels that could be used for side quests, then things could be a bit more interesting, or maybe they could have just had more walkable parts so each city had its own unique things to see and do. Like, say, each of these zones have a number of smaller zones within them. Some parts could have enemies and some wouldn't, so you could design the quests a bit better. It works well in games like Crosscode, and I think it would have worked well here too. That game has zones in between all of the major locations to where you can fight enemies and do quests. This game just doesn't utilize all of its pieces to its fullest effect. There's just so much dead air here that it honestly feels like they didn't know what to do. Which is sad because I was really expecting more from this game considering the production value. The main gimmick of this game is that it's a pixel art 2D game set in a 3D environment. But even with all that, the novelty wears off pretty quickly. While it looks and feels impressive, it's kinda hollow because they don't take it too far. It also starts to wear off after a while because it becomes less interesting. Even the aesthetic of the world was something I came to dislike as the game went on, because they weren't doing anything with it. Many of the locations you visit are incredibly dull and mostly exist for one primary reason. The more combat-oriented levels, that is. As for the hub areas, I think a day and night cycle would have worked a lot better for this game because then, each of the locations could have had varying looks to them. Anno sets itself inside of a cyberpunk world but uses it as a backdrop. The entire world is filled with detail and yet you have no real way to have fun with it, just appreciate it from a distance. That's all my pieces for the exploration side of the game. I felt it necessary to bring that up now because Anno is trying to be 3 different games at once. An open world game, a linear story game, and a Metroidvania, and within all of those are major aspects that make them up: exploration, story, and combat. So I think it's necessary to explore each of the type of games that Anno tries to be and explain how it fails at each of the other aspects. I wanted to spread this section on exploration across the whole video, but I felt it would have made things unorganized. Plus, it's the easiest part of the game to talk about. Next we'll be doing the story, and just like the exploration, I'll be interjecting points and comments as we go. So your first objective is to go into Ann's email. This is where you learn that she has a strange disease called entanglitis that makes her lose focus and go crazy. So you head to a doctor in town to get yourself checked out. In these messages, you'll also hear about something called N540, which is meant to be a cure for her disease, and with all that info, we can carefully assume the main objective of the game is to find N540 and heal Anne. So you head to the doctor and he does your checkup. He also does the combat tutorial, which I won't talk about right now. Right after this, you immediately get sent away to another city after Anne gets a call from her sister, Nakamura. Nakamura runs a bar in the town of Margarita. Here she wants you to just take over for her at the bar, but this is mostly just to introduce the bartending minigame. I don't know why, but I found this bartending minigame to be really fun. It's kind of sad that it's just one note and it has nothing to do with the story. It exists mostly just to give a reference to Valhalla. The far more interesting thing here is that you get to visit Ann's childhood home. A lot of things in this small apartment are interactable and they give you small pieces of info on Anne and the rest of her family. There are even these little vignettes of the past that we get to see. There are even more of these that we get to see later on in the story. I think these opening parts are here so that we can understand more about Anne. She very clearly moved away from her family because her entanglitis made her believe that she was a threat to everyone. Obviously her family wants her to come home, but she won't for reasons. Now we get to a part of the story that is strange. Nakamura tells Anne that a woman needs her help. This woman seems to know something about Anne and her entanglitis, however these random dudes appear at the bar and ask for Ryan. Anne comes over and instead of asking any important questions, she immediately starts fighting them and then we get the information. So apparently these guys are from a gang whose name I'm never going to try saying multiple times in this video. They want Ryan because he stole something from them. Then right after this, you talk to Ann's dad and he tells you to look for Ryan in another city. This quick jump to all these different locations really makes it hard to care about any single level in the game. But this isn't the only problem here. This short sequence that I just went through is how the whole game works from now on. You go somewhere, enter a scene that tries to give you some sort of pointers on the story, then get interrupted by something, get pushed into a fight, and end up doing something else for no reason before going back to the original intention of the scene, trying to learn more about the main story. Getting the Noctis starts the decline of the game's story, which is sad because the game literally just started. It begins this huge cat and mouse chase to find the ROM that Ryan has in order to learn more about where he is. By the way, Ryan is Ann's brother and he's also looking for N540. As soon as you get to Noctis City, 2 incredibly strange things happen. First, the game finally does this tarot card, and by this point, it's so unexpected that I kinda got excited because I thought this is where things were gonna get more interesting, but they don't. The other thing is that as soon as you get here, you're automatically teleported inside of this building, and you never get the chance to come back here again. Which really hurts the exploration even more because this is your introduction to Noctis. Anyway, here you're introduced to the Hacking Minigame, which was another piece of gameplay that I enjoyed. Inside the room, you find a ROM that has some information about Ryan, but it's stolen from you pretty quickly. A chase scene begins as Ann is attacked by a guy named Loki. Don't get used to him because this is like one of the 2 times you see him in the entire game. This chase scene is really strange because there's no real sense of direction here. You'll run forward to fight some enemies, then have to turn back and jump up in order to keep going. There's a part of this chase scene that really pisses me off. You see Loki running in the opposite direction of you, so you go opposite to him, fight some enemies, and then you go into a hallway and start running in the exact same direction that he was going. This was the moment when I started to wonder why they chose to have this sort of gameplay style when they still made scenes like this. This all concludes in the boss fight because why not? Loki gets inside of this forklift mech suit. Okay, that actually sounds pretty cool. This fight is actually really quick because you can just spam your attacks while dodging his occasionally. Once you beat him, you get a new weapon that carries over into the rest of the game. Ann falls out because of her entanglitis. Then she is rescued by some guy named Raymond. The way that he comes off, you might think that he's someone that Ann knows and that he'll have a bigger importance in the game, but this is probably one of the only times you'll see him in the entire story. Ann goes to the dock in order to check on her condition. Afterwards, he said that he has a weapon for her that is in a nearby shop. So you go to the shop, and the guy there says that he needs the weapon to be crafted, but he can't be crafted in Scop City for some reason. So you have to go to Noctis to get it crafted. This just confirms for me why we couldn't explore Noctis beforehand, because if we could, there's a chance that the player may have been able to find this place on their own, but it doesn't even matter. This crafting system is pretty useless in the grand scheme of things, but we'll talk about that later. I really don't like this back and forth. Couldn't we just have a string of objectives in one location before moving to the next? If you actually did it like this, then some of these empty areas can be justified because they wouldn't exist solely for the story. Like the next area we have to go to, Freeway 42. You could have gotten a quest from the guy in the weapon shop about this place, and you can sort of see it if you look carefully on the map. While in Noctis, INA points out that there's an information broker who can help us. Apparently this guy has made tons of transactions regarding N540, and yet Ann never gets to ask him about any of them. I get that the whole point of the game is to find Ryan, but like she's looking for a cure for her disease, and there's a guy right here in front of her who could help her with that, and she just decides not to ask any questions. Anyway, we have to get a brand new outfit in order to get inside the club that he's in. I wish this had gone differently in that there was a quest that sent you around Noctis to get the right materials to make this dress, instead of you just going into a store and then you already get it. Doing this would have allowed the crafting system to have more meaning, and it would have been a great opportunity for Ann and INA to interact some more. And it would also give life to Noctis instead of it being the place that you just come and go from so quickly over the course of the story. So you meet the informant and he asks you to defeat this robot boar guy that you probably saw earlier during the chase with Loki. He's an easy fight, but there isn't too much to him. There are 2 strange things that happen after this though. The first is that the masked woman shows up again and she shows you the fast travel system. These water pools actually teleport you to another location, but it's weird that they chose to put this here when there's no logistical reason for it to exist here. First of all, we have to go back to someone that's in this city. Second of all, wouldn't it make more sense to introduce this after we've already found one, which is something that they do anyway. Like, this is the type of thing that would be introduced to the player in the story if they had to get back to a location quickly because the scene is urgent, not for some random fetch quest. The other weird thing here is that INA proclaims she couldn't see the woman Ann was talking to, but somehow Nakamura back at the bar could see her. It's how they were able to introduce her, and you can't say, oh, Nakamura saw the woman because she's related to Ann, so it must be a family thing, but they aren't related by blood. The game makes that very clear, as we'll see coming up. So you head back to the guy and he says that we can find out more about N540 and Freeway 42. Now, before we move on, I want to bring up a scene I haven't mentioned yet, the cutscene that plays before you travel to Noctis. These 2 guys, oddly named C and G, are talking about something and then being incredibly vague about it. I hate every single scene with these 2 characters because it showcases that the game has far more interesting ideas that it chooses to do nothing with. In this scene, they're talking about portal tests that are linked to what we saw in the intro, and that's it. No further info in this at all. It's one of the many cool ideas that the game has and decides to just be left there as filler. When you get to Freeway 42, the atmosphere is already different. The people here are a bit more cybernetic than the others that we've seen so far before a different reason. Apparently in this universe, before the game started, there was an outbreak of something called the Mechanica virus, which is apparently something that turns people into robots. It sounds strange and it's kinda cool, but this is another idea that the game doesn't elaborate on. You go through a sewer level and fight your way through many worm-like enemies and some robots. These worms have different forms, but like most other enemies, spamming attacks and dodging when possible is the best way to deal with them. Then Ann has this flashback dream sequence in this weird alternate dimension. We're told by the masked woman that this place is called Hinterland, and it's a world filled with strange monsters and anomalies that Ann can travel to within her mind. And then the whole area ends with you fighting these mutant robot warriors and finding a secret underground village filled with people who are still afflicted with the Mechanica virus. All this sounds really insane. I really wonder how it's all going to play out in the grand scheme of things. I said earlier that those two guys were talking about portal tests. Does this mean that the game will eventually have monsters and beings from other worlds in order to appear for cool boss fights and maybe some fun exploration? No. Because as soon as you get here, the Elder asks you to clear out some more mutants, and then you get 2 boring boss fights, and then you leave. It's all because Ryan hasn't been here. This is such a big waste of time that I am baffled that it's still in the game. They even point out that something else might be going on, but they choose to ignore it. There's only one side quest here, and it's helping a guy fix a lift. Both boss fights are against characters that are just as underdeveloped as this area. Also, it's incredibly strange that the first guy is just down here. From where you're standing, you can see him from the underground city. It's not like there's a wall separating the city and him, so how did no one else notice him? This is exactly what I meant when I said that the game is like a bad anime, because it features all these side characters that serve no purpose for the plot and exist for cool fight scenes. So that's what this is, a cool but pointless fight scene. The other staple of bad anime is in this scene as well, the main character getting pointless transformations. So this is a mock, some mysterious woman in Hinterland that An can turn into whenever the gauge at the top left of the screen gets full. Looking at this design, I wish An just looked like this all the time. It's way cooler and it fits more with the stuff the game is trying to do. Instead we get generic female badass. Even after getting brought back up to the secret village, all we get is a new weapon and then we're just sent on our way. Then we fight something that I would have preferred to have just been a regular enemy. They say that these are mutated beasts, but they're never expanded on, just like everything else in this section. What an absolute waste of time. As soon as you leave, we get another cutscene with C. This time he's talking to the guy that we just fought. His name is Absalom, by the way, and you wouldn't have known that because they didn't put his name on the screen when you fought him. But with the way this scene is put together, you seriously would not be able to tell what the hell is going on. The way that this is framed is almost as if this giant rotating square in the center of the room is what he's talking to. And then after that, another new character appears with zero introduction and just places himself within the story. Just like that Raymond guy, the story would have you believe that he's way more important than he comes off, but fails to give him any actual importance. So it turns out the next place we have to go to is somehow connected to that underground city. It's some facility that seems to be infected with more of those worm enemies we fought earlier. In this facility, you are once again visited by the masked woman, and this is where most of the game's lore is told to us. So it turns out this large crater that was bombed in the intro is called Lyman. Apparently this thing has some powers that the Consortium, the place where these bad guys from the other scenes work, they want to destroy it because it causes disasters. When they couldn't destroy it, they took a very strange route and decided to make 7 humanoid children with dangerous superpowers, and An is obviously one of these children. Her power is that she can travel to another dimension within her mind. This dimension is called Hinterland. And they believe that using Hinterland they can find a way to close Lyman. So Lyman is some sort of dimensional portal. And with the way that this is explained, An is some sort of key to closing that portal. But later on they revealed that they erased her memories and let her leave the Consortium because they didn't have the tools necessary to develop her powers. Which is the stupidest explanation ever. Why would they do that if they need her to close Lyman? They said that they were going to bring her back eventually, but something caused her to come back even sooner. So what the fuck was the plan? Wait until she's like 30 years old and then bring her back because she would then have better control of her powers? And the whole idea of her coming back sooner makes no sense because you kidnapped her brother to force her to come back. Also, out of all of these 7 humanoid children that we hear about, An and this little girl that we rescue at the end of this level are the only ones that we see. Is this guy that we fought earlier supposed to be one of these children? And if he is, why is he still working for the Consortium when An got to leave? This is supposed to be the big moment where some cards are finally laid out and we get more info about the story, but no, instead it begs more questions, which it should do, but not the questions that we should be asking. So we take the girl and leave her with An's dad and Margarita, and right after that, we have to go back to fucking Noctis. This is becoming a real problem, especially when you realize that we won't be seeing this little girl do anything important until the end of the game. We literally picked her up to drop her off somewhere else and kick her out of the story. We seriously have to go back to Noctis, beat up Loki, and then have him tell us that this whole fight was pointless and that we should just go talk to the boss of the gang that Loki is in. And what a fucking surprise, INA already has all the information that we need to get there. This is the part of the story to where I checked out. I was done with this shit and I just wanted it to be over at this point. So the next zone is just a repeat of the last one. You arrive at this interesting looking hub area, then you get one objective within the hub area, in this case fighting in this tournament, meet someone so cool looking that they should have been the boss or bad guy of this level, and then you go through a boring looking dungeon with recycled enemies and an unspecial boss at the end. I seriously don't want to go piece by piece with this ship level, simply looking at it is boring. There are some pieces I want to talk about and it has more to do with the story. First of all, on the way here you meet another character who just shows up and disappears until the end of the game. Then he tells you this story that you would believe has some sort of importance to the plot, but it doesn't.
My friend was the finest among the children, kind-hearted and decisive. She'd often help other kids during training. One day, their instructor gave them a difficult task. The children all had to make a choice, and all hesitated. But she stepped up and finished the task with excellence. Yet, when she came back, she found out that all the other kids had died because of her choice. She was distraught, blaming herself for the others' deaths. She committed suicide. But this was not the end. Time was set back to before the task. This time, she made the right choice and saved all the children.
I thought this story was the explanation for why we don't see those other superpowered children, but no, it's just some random story he decided to tell. He also says that An looks like someone that he used to know, but we also never learn who that is either. Is it supposed to be the masked woman? Because she takes off her mask near the end of the game, but there's no reveal that she's another An or someone similar. She just takes off her mask and then the story keeps going without telling us what this means. Another thing that happens is that we get a recording from Robot Dad and he shows us that the little girl has the ability to alter reality. She summons Santa Claus to showcase this. I hope I'm not getting off track by explaining the story. It's surprising that I'm getting confused even as I'm writing this. You actually can go back to your dad and ask about what you saw in the recording, but by the time you do, the consortium comes and gets the girl. Let me pause for a minute because I think I'm moving a bit too fast here. My biggest problem with this story is that there's nothing to latch on to. Whenever you think some development is happening, like meeting Sigrid, you would expect the story to explore that idea and explain why it exists within the story, but it doesn't. This makes later scenes strange. When you meet Sigrid again at the end of the game, she pretends as if you've been there the whole time, when in reality I don't think she was even conscious to see that An was the one who saved her. The bad guys are also underdeveloped. Every single scene with them left me clueless because it was hard to interpret what these scenes are even supposed to mean. It's like they're talking about something that we should already know about, and these bad guys are always doing things that An never gets to be a part of. I get that she's looking for her brother, and this may be a case of the writers not wanting An to feel like the center of the universe, but she doesn't feel like anything in the story and only becomes important at the very end. The game feels rushed, like someone wanted to flesh out this story and give it the proper treatment that it deserves, but there were other priorities that I may not know about because, to me, it feels like the story is the main focus. Or maybe the game was split between those three types of games I spoke about earlier. Some people wanted a Metroidvania, some people wanted a linear action game, and some wanted an open world game. They couldn't decide, so they chose to do all of them at the same time and just see what the result was. So the whole ordeal up until this point is getting this ROM back so we can find out where Ryan is. This seriously feels like a plot thread that should have concluded by now, but no, this actually marks the halfway point of the game. When you look into the ROM, you find out that Ryan has been to Doc's lab, so you rush back there and you get to the best boss fight in the game. As soon as you try to take the elevator down, you are instantly teleported to another dimension where this random child starts crying and then he turns into a large mecha. This thing is really fun to fight because it doesn't die in under a minute. He actually has a lot of moves to cycle through and even a phase where you have to use your missile launcher weapon to take him down. This back and forth is actually fun because it feels like you're actually fighting him instead of just spamming your attacks. However, this boss does have some issues, and I think now would probably be the best time to talk about combat so we can address those issues. I said earlier that Anno's combat is boring as fuck, but there's actually a lot more issues with it than just being unenjoyable. For starters, the game has 4 different weapon types: short swords, twin blades, great swords, and guns. Not to forget that An has a super form that she can enter to where you can only use your regular attacks or your great sword. When you start the tutorial, the initial idea you'll have with Anno is that it will feature a simple combat system where you attack, roll, or block when necessary. But what you'll come to realize quickly as you fight through most battles is that the game wants you to be playing in a way that is incapable of working. The game wants you doing combo attacks, but just looking at the skill tree and then trying out these moves yourself, you'll see that a majority, if not all of these attacks have little to no use whatsoever. Some of them don't even work most of the time, and even if you try to get off combos, there's another issue that prevents that. Before I get into that though, I want to talk about the skill tree and the weapons a bit more. There are 3 types of currency in the game: regular cash, Grom bits, and Grom upgrade coins. The cash is for buying things, the Grom bits is for buying combo moves in the skill tree, and the Grom upgrade coins are for upgrading the stats of Anne. In my opinion, this skill tree should have had just one currency and should have been reduced to only the natural stat upgrades and other small tweaks like increasing the length of your super form and how many bullets are in each magazine. Because like I said earlier, the rest are either combo moves that are pointless in combat or simple percentage modifiers. The weapons are also strange. Most of them needed to be crafted with the exception of the guns, which you'll just find better versions of as you play. But the swords are the most important here. Despite being craftable, I never found a good reason to do this, nor did I feel like I was ever incentivized into doing so. And whenever I did want to craft new weapons, I couldn't because I never had the materials to do so. Which is incredibly strange because there are so many lootable containers in every single corner of this game filled to the brim with useless shit that is only meant to be dismantled for crafting materials. And even then I never got any of the materials needed to craft better weapons. Or I just never got enough. Why not just put the crafting materials within the containers? Not to mention that these weapons have a chip system that allow you to add modifiers to them. Another thing that I never ever felt the need to worry about because the game never took the time to make it seem like something I should be focusing on. Back in the scene where Anne beats up those guys behind her sister's bar, the game shows you how to scan enemies to see their health and what element they fall under. There are 3 elements, fire, ice, and thunder, and not only did I completely forget about this mechanic right after this fight, no enemy in the whole game except for, I think, 3 bosses ever showcased that they had any sort of elemental abilities. So explaining it is pointless because the player is never going to notice it anyway, with the exception of those 3 boss fights, of course. And I should point out that one of these boss fights is in a side quest, and the other one is one of the final bosses of the game. And even if you do, it doesn't matter because there's no sort of indicator that attacking an enemy's weakness helps at all. If all the weapons in the game were built with these elemental modifiers, then this whole issue goes away. A game like Untitled already does this to great effect, not to mention that there are statuses applied to each element. Fire burns enemies, ice freezes them, and thunder paralyzes them. A system like this in Anno could be really fun. That's my issue with the game's combat and gameplay as a whole. Unless you're being forced to use something, I completely forget it exists in the game. Anno has a type of combat that I just don't enjoy, because it's completely based on spamming attacks, or at least it makes you spam attacks. The enemies also contribute to how boring combat feels. Many of them are just reskins with different health and weapons. Some have guns, or explosives, or lasers. All these can be dealt with by just blocking, or rolling out of the way, or rolling through them. The thing that I noticed is that Anno will just spam you with a lot of enemies in one location, instead of interestingly crafted enemy encounters. And I say this because this isn't the type of game where you're going to be doing a lot of backtracking through most of its combat-oriented levels, so each moment of combat could have been built with some sort of minor challenge. Some sort of arena with pits that you can fall into. Maybe the walls have jets that shoot fire and you have to be on the right side of the arena to not take damage. Parts of the floor can be breakable and you have to carefully dance around that. These sort of scenarios can make combat more enjoyable, and they can be built around the amount of weapons and upgrades that you get throughout the game. The other issue with enemies is that smaller ones are far too easy to beat, and the larger non-boss enemies are far too annoying. They'll begin their attack, and by the time they're done, they'll be on the opposite side of the arena, because their models are still moving throughout the whole attack. Something I also noticed is that some of these enemies will do these attacks that force them to move away from you, and then immediately perform another attack where there is nothing in range for them to hit. You'd think that these attacks would be going out to the player if they were in range. Bosses usually get a pass on this sort of thing because they are always in this active state to perform attacks regardless of what the player is doing, but it's still strange. I seriously wonder what the intended response is here, because if you dodge through an enemy right as you see them start their attack, you're going to be doing a lot of moving around trying to get back into position to strike them before they start their next move. And I'll let you know again that you have the ability to double jump, air dash, and wall climb, and yet none of these are used in any of the boss fights. Not even once. Some attacks have the enemies in the air, but that's only for the briefest of time. This is why many people label the combat as uninteresting. It's dodge, attack, wait, dodge, attack, and then that's every single fight in the entire game. And it doesn't change no matter what or who you were up against. I don't really have much left to say. Combat was so boring that I barely remember most of it. Okay, so now we're at a part of the story that I mentioned earlier. We end up down a long chain of levels and corridors that feel like they strung together a couple levels one after another. The scenery for all of these changes only minimally, and that also includes the enemies you'll be fighting down here. Anyway, nothing too new is happening here. You meet a monkey doctor, which continues the trend of interesting characters being pushed to the side. He wants you to journey deeper underground to find him, and I think they realize that Ann is already here and they want her to come to the consortium's headquarters, which is underground, beneath Scop City, which is a major coincidence and makes no sense because they must have known she was in Scop City since she regularly works with the police. They've already kidnapped Ryan by the time you get to them, and they used him to lure her onto the consortium. Wouldn't it just make more sense to come to her on the surface? If they're scared of being discovered because they are meant to be a secret organization, then just plant someone within the agency she works for as a spy. There are many better options than this place being beneath the city you started and then having to go through all this other shit we went through in the game if they were just going to capture Ryan and be right under our noses the entire time. They also capture INA, and it makes it really hard to make a choice at the end of the game because no one would side with these idiots who threaten you at every chance and are the sole reason for all of her problems. There's another scene here where we see Absalom talking to C, and C is now going crazy. I'm going to be honest and say that by this point in the story I wasn't caring because this is where they just rush everything to the conclusion. C starts going crazy and Absalom has no reaction to this, so it just adds to the confusion. It's also extra confusing now because C's evil voice sounds just like Dr. Monkey.
Here, I'll help.
This is the final point I'm going to mention before we get to the game's ending. In this zone, you fight a group of powerful mechabots, and what INA says after the fight really makes me angry. She points out that the robots you just fought are from a group called Anderson Industries, and she's confused because they are supposed to be military bots and is wondering who put them here. Ann immediately questions the same thing, and then the scene cuts away and you just keep moving forward. I hate this because of the way that it's brought up. They make it seem like it's going to be a big thing, but we're getting close to the end of the game, so it doesn't matter. Anno is the type of game that has tons of background lore that it doesn't use and expects the player to care or know about it. The Mechanica virus, these robots, the gang that is apparently so much of a threat that they are constantly destroying buildings in Noctis, which is strange because when you see Noctis, it's almost like a normal cyberpunk city. No one in the city even talks about the gang. The first time I loaded up the game, I got a message on the loading screen telling me about a president character who was working to expand Scop City, and this character never appeared in the whole game. There are tons of flyers and data entries that speak about things going on, but they are never brought up in the story. And the worst cases of this are with the many side quests in the game. Now, side quests are meant to be breaks from the story that provide looks into the world from the perspective of other characters. But the side quests in Anno showcase that there is so much more interesting shit happening than what the game makes us follow. Now that I think about it, the idea with the president could have been the perfect excuse to open up the game more. Each area could have been explorable to a certain degree, but after a trigger point, new zones in that city unlock and now you have more characters to meet, more quests to do, and more things to see. Just like in Crosscode when another portion of the starter area opens up. And with the way the map is set up, it honestly feels like this was the intended idea. So maybe they ran out of time or money, or just like many other things in the game, this message is here just to be cool and serves no other purpose. The side quests are no better, however. These are the pinnacle of this problem with Anno and how ideas and potential are wasted. There's only a handful of them, and yet they leave so much room to expand the game. The first quest people are going to get is the one with the guy in the sewer winning a certain treat. This one is fine. You can only get side quests in Scop City and Noctis. Harbor City has the tournament, which I found to be okay. Freeway 42 has a quest that you'll do as a part of the main quest there anyway. And Margarita has the bartending minigame, which was surprisingly my favorite part of Anno and got me excited to play Valhalla. So there are 11 side quests in the game in total. In my opinion, it's actually 9 because 2 of them you do for the main story. Finding the blueprint in Freeway 42 for the gun shop owner and fighting Melissa. The others are either fine, kinda good, and upsetting because once again they show how lacking Anno's storytelling is. I'm not going to go over all 9 of them, but I will cover the ones that support my point. In Scop City, in On's apartment building, someone has been murdered. You have to check for clues in their room, watch a security clip to find the culprit, and then do an elevator puzzle that has you going to specific floors in order to find the suspect. Turns out he's in another dimension, trapped here by someone called the Great Daughter. Someone he is clearly scared of, but the game never takes the time to realize that he may be in some sort of trance because of this. He confesses to the crime, but that could just be him being mind-controlled. An doesn't even flinch when she hears about this, and considering the shit she learns later on in the story, it's doubly infuriating when you realize there's no continuation to this quest. She just reports to the lady officer and says, "Job well done." This is exactly what I mean when I say the game has tons of wasted potential. There is no way someone made this quest and decided to end it here. I refuse to believe that. A quest you get later on is even worse. Apparently you have to track down a group of rogue cyborgs who have been let loose in the city. I repeat, rogue cyborgs have been let loose in the city. You don't even meet one, you just end up giving money to this girl to help her fix her fucking robot dog, or you can turn her over to the police. I hope I demonstrated just how lackluster this game's story is by showcasing all the potential that it had and it chose to do nothing. And this isn't me going, fighting cyborgs is way cooler than looking for my missing brother, it's the fact that it exists and they chose to do nothing with this. Let's go back to the other side quest I said you'll be doing during the main story, fighting Melissa. This will also allow me to start talking about the end of the game. Between this and Melissa you have another fight with Absalom where he has more moves. In my opinion, all of these should have been in the first fight to make it a bit more fun. After this you get another scene with C and this other guy who's called G. It appears that C wants to use Lyman to reset the world, so that's typical villain shit. To be honest, this is fine, but it would be better if we understood Lyman a bit more. I think they only say the name of it like 3 times in the whole game. After this, you have another boss fight with 2 random women and then a fight with the monster from the tutorial, and then Ione gets kidnapped. Right after she gets kidnapped, you pass a point of no return and end up meeting Castor and Melissa. I'm not going to spend time complaining because they'll be removed from the story as quickly as they came in. It seems that they want to take something from Hinterland and bring it to the real world. This giant spear which seems to be holding a mock back. We get a fake game over screen, which is just not as cool as many other fake game over screens. The masked lady saves you and says that a mock cannot be led into the real world or else she'll destroy it. Castor is literally in the next room and surprisingly he sends you to fight Melissa and then they are teleported somewhere else after you beat her. Let's not linger and just keep moving forward. The spear has the ability to cause interdimensional wreckage. This spear is also what I believe was holding a mock back, who they reveal is just An but in Hinterland. It's also never explained why a mock wants to destroy the world. Oh, they also say that if a portal to Hinterland is forced open then An will die, but there's no way they're gonna follow through on that considering that the game is almost over. So you finally make it to the consortium and they have Ryan tied up. 2 things happen here. First of all, they all say that we need to stop a certain person because if we don't, the world will end. That's not true because the person that we need to defeat is C. And the masked lady just told us that his plan failed because we destroyed the teleportation tech that he was trying to use to get the spear from Hinterland. So his plan is ruined and there's nothing he can do, but we need a stupid final boss, so whatever. The little girl from before, by the way, she was taken by the consortium, but it appears to have happened right after this scene, I think. You can go to An's dad and he'll tell you exactly that, but I was expecting her to come up a bit more because of how important she is now. So this fight has you protect her through 3 waves of enemies as she's chanced a magical spell to remove a dragon from sea. What? Where did this come from? Why is there suddenly a dragon? There is zero explanation for this. This is officially the point in the game where it becomes a bad movie. Or a bad anime to be precise, which you'll remember is the term I used at the beginning of this video. The whole game reeks of this idea that somebody wanted to make an anime but couldn't. Think about it. The world is uninteresting and is just a template version of another story. The main character is a badass who has a sad past, which is why she shows so little emotion. She has 2 sisters that look better than her and a dumbass little brother who is the only reason why the plot happens. There are some creative ideas, but they exist just for cool fight scenes. Everyone has these weird, unexplainably strong superpowers that also exist for stupid fight scene. The main character's powers are related to her emotions and she can't control them unless the story wants her to. There's a secret organization that is doing evil shit, but they try to be the good guys. Despite being in a sci-fi world, there are more fantasy aspects than anything else. The main character has some female friend who is in love with her.
Arrogant. Hey, you can't say that about a person who saved your life. I was so worried about you when you went splat. Oh. Darling, aren't you gonna do something to comfort me? Get off first. I need comforting. Get off. Nah, I won't. Kiss. Stay away from me.
I can imagine this being some 12 to 24 episode anime on Netflix or some shit. So this dragon fight is just what you would expect. He has a lot of moves, but other than that, he doesn't feel really special. To be honest, this fight is indicative of the whole story, something that just exists for fun. And the thing is, I wanted to have fun, but I couldn't because I couldn't stop thinking about all the pitfalls that this game falls into over its short runtime. If you fleshed out all these ideas, you can get a really amazing game with a good story, but instead I got a bad anime in video game form. I know it feels like I was rushing through the last segment of the story, but the story itself was rushing through itself. To finish up Ann's story before talking about the ending, she gets N540 to put an end to her entanglitis. Then she gets told that she is Subject 06 of the Gatekeeper Project, which was apparently something that the Consortium did to travel and communicate with other dimensions. Ann can do that naturally because of her powers. They also say that they let her go because they didn't have what it took to control her at the Consortium. So they just let this incredibly dangerous test subject out in the world where her powers could potentially run free. Why though? Because after this we see that they do have the tech, so why? But then they tell us that their whole plan and the reason the Consortium was founded was to close Lamin because they created numerous problems across the world, including the Mechanica virus. Everything in this game feels like it's used wrong. There's something so off with this game trying to be this open world action game, trying to have a linear story, and trying to be a Metroidvania. If it stuck to one, then it could be better, but I think the best idea is for it to just become a Metroidvania. All the lore here could make for a compelling world, and many of the characters could make for compelling boss fights. You wouldn't even have to change the story that much, just set it in Hinterland and it could have been a weird mixture of sci-fi and fantasy, so many of the already existing ideas can have a place. If you wanted a linear story, then I think the whole story would need an overhaul, and if you wanted an open world game, you would still have to overhaul the story and then do some actual world building. I've been seeing people say that this is better than Cyberpunk 2077, but at least in that game, they tried to use the system that they had instead of trying to be so many things at once. The pieces to a fantastic game are here, they're just lost in this weird mesh of conflicting ideas. And now finally, after everything has happened, Ann finally meets up with Ryan and G. She is given a choice, to wear a special bracelet that will suppress her powers, but she has to stay within the Consortium until they can solve the problems with Hinterland. Now, another ending was added to the game after I bought it, so that means that the main ending was this. Ann rejects the proposal, Ryan continues to be the most obnoxious character in the game despite having the least amount of screen time, pushes G, and gets himself shot. This causes a mock to take over Ann and literally take over the world. Now, some people have said that this happens because the game wanted this to be a not-so-happy ending, but I don't think so. The idea is sound. Ann and the player obviously aren't going to help these idiots, and why would you? Ann is smart and a capable fighter. They could have just simply approached her and asked for her help. It would eventually make C's actions more impactful and by association everyone else in the Consortium. But no, they kidnap your friends and family and force you to do it, which is why many people are going to pick this ending, or maybe that's why this ending was the only ending until a new one was patched into the game. The other ending involves Ann deciding to stay with the Consortium and help them with Hinterland. They do this by making her fight a mock in a quick boss fight. Afterwards, she just leaves. I think they contain a mock, but it's never clear. You just beat her and then they let you leave. But the way this conversation goes, it looks like they're setting up a sequel. The Consortium wants On to act as their eyes on the outside world, checking for any supernatural occurrences. This is the last part of the story that infuriates me, because if what I just said was the main premise of this game and the rest of the story happens as it already did, then I would not be making this video, or at least I wouldn't be so hard on it. Having On already working for the Consortium fixes so many issues with the main story that I am certain someone at Thinking Stars put this in the game knowing how cool of an idea it was. So maybe in the next game, On will be fighting more weird things connected to other dimensions. Who knows? But that's it for the story. There's actually a lot of little criticisms that I left out to save time, because this video is already long enough. For anyone who has made it this far, you might be wondering why I spent so much time focusing on the story. Well, that's because by the time I finished this game, it really felt like something was missing in nearly every part of the story. The game is about 12 hours long, and yet it feels shorter than that. I usually don't like shorter games, especially ones with plots like this, because things are never really fleshed out. And the other thing is that I feel pity for this game because they were trying to be multiple things at once and failed. Anno Mutationem is a game I wish I loved. It has ambition, but no desire to achieve it. It's the type of game that by the time I finished it, I wish there was already a better game just like it. And some people may say that that game already exists.